What's up YouTube, Capital G here, giving you guys a quick little card discussion on a nice little piece of spicy tech that I have really noticed picking up a lot of steam over the past maybe 10 days to a week in the TCG for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! This is a card that originally a lot of people thought would just kind of be relegated to the side deck, but it's actually been migrated over to the main deck almost seamlessly, and it's actually seeing some legitimate results. It's a card that is 100% uncounterable, which makes it particularly attractive for a lot of meta players, and it is incredibly solid against a multitude of the meta decks, especially if you're going second and your opponent has made one of those unbreakable boards where you're pretty much just praying that your top deck a spear mode. This can be the card to answer those situations. So what card are we talking about in this video? We are going to be talking about Super Polymerization, and Super Polymerization is an OG card. It's from Phantom Darkness. It's super old GX era. It's a card that historically has seen a lot of play in fusion decks mainly. That's where it's seen its most success because those are the decks that are inherently going to run the fusion monsters needed to be summoned from Super Polymerization in the first place. However, it has been used sometimes against fusion decks as well, and that's one of the reasons why it's actually starting to pop up now. Super Polymerization is a card that has always been looked at as a very solid card, although kind of niche. And if you guys are, know your Yu-Gi-Oh history, you know that I would say the best two examples of fusion decks that have been able to get a lot out of this card have probably been Elemental Heroes and then also Shadows. Elemental Heroes because they did have fusion monsters for pretty much the entire attribute wheel, and then Shadows because of the same thing. Shadows actually took it a step further because their plays were not quite as linear as Elemental Heroes. It wasn't just about dropping, a big fusion monster, but Shadows could actually maybe summon a Shadow construct with the regular Shadow fusion. Then they could Super Polymerization during the battle phase, and then they could also use that same fusion monster for like L Shadow fusion in that battle phase. And there was a deck that could actually OTK with Super Poly relatively easily, let alone the fact that they could use materials from both player sides of the field. And it was so impactful that eventually Super Polymerization did get ultimately banned in the TCG, and it obviously wasn't unbanned for years later. But why exactly are we starting to see this card pop up now, let alone pop up in actual main decks? And I was watching a regional over the weekend. It was being live streamed on Facebook. The regional was taking place in France. I'm not exactly sure what city, but it was taking place in France, and it was something interesting that happened. So this was a tier 1 matchup that saw Danger Thunder Dragon facing off against Sky Striker, and the Danger Thunder Dragon player went first, and he had an absolutely awesome turn 1 play. I mean, he basically did the epitome of what that deck can do. He made Saryuja Skull Dread, 2 copies of Thunder Dragon Colossus, which were in defense mode. He had a Zombie Stein, and he had a Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss. And as a Sky Striker player, I don't even know where you begin to try to attack that board. I mean, it's bad enough that you're not going to be able to search, but if you thought things like Afterburner or maybe Widow Anchor were going to be outs to the board, they just weren't, because he had double negation. So you have to have like 2 Widow Anchors just to be able to start playing, let alone to start actually clearing the monsters, because the negations are going to start eating up your spells, and realistically you have like a 1% chance of winning that duel. But he just calmly activated Super Polymerization from his hand. He got rid of the double Colossus, and then he basically just broke his opponent's entire board with just 2 cards, and he was able to outgrind him because he had 4 cards. His opponent had nothing left in his hand, and he was able to just simply say, all right, I'm gonna go for my basic plays here, knowing that I can do everything that I want, etc., etc. And I saw it and I was like, damn, that was incredibly impressive. But man, maybe it's just this guy coming up with some 200 IQ. And then I noticed a little later in the day there were players using it and like Guru Control and other decks, and I was like, I think that this is actually really starting to catch on. And I think that one of the reasons is that Super Polymerization is so good at breaking established boards. So you guys know that Salamangreats are easily the most popular deck in the TCG, and it is a deck that happens to put a board up of usually Sunlight Wolf plus Stalyo, and then they'll have either Jack Jaguar, or if they're playing really cautious, they'll link summon into the copy of Balix, and they usually have Roar on the field, the Infernity Barrier type card, to stop anything the opponent throws at them. Well, the good thing about this, the good thing about Super Polymerization in this matchup is the fact that Super Poly is like one of the only cards in the game that can straight up 100% play around Salamangreat Roar. You simply activate Super Polymerization, you use all of their monsters on the field as the materials. If they do have Balinks plus the copy of Sunlight Wolf, you're going to use both of their Link monsters, and then you'll summon your copy of Violent Chimera from your extra deck. Your opponent will no longer control a Link, which means not only could their Roar not be activated in response of the Super Polymerization, your opponent will not have a Salamangreat monster on field, so their Roar essentially becomes a dead card and or useless for the remainder of that turn. But Super Polymerization doesn't just stop there. It's not just good against Salamangreats because it allows you to get rid of some of your opponent's Salamangreats and then also play around Roar. Hell, you even get your own big behemoth boss monster all at the same time. The card is actually fantastic against most of the combo decks that are seeing high-level competitive play in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now. I talked about the Danger Thunder Dragon deck, but even if your opponent's deck is not fusion-based, they're still going to get wrecked by this card, or at least a lot of their turn 1 board is going to get eviscerated by it. It can be an Orcus variant, it can be a Guard Dragon version, whether it's Blue Eyes or the Crusadia Guard Dragons, they're all just going to lose to this. Your opponent can have infinite amount of negations on their board, and guess what? They're completely powerless to use them because once you activate Super Polymerization, they cannot activate any cards or effects in any capacity, and they're just going to have to sit there, take it, and lose their monsters while you're able to summon a boss monster of your own. And I like it because a lot of these decks have the same ideology, right? These combo decks, basically they're trying to make it so that you play as little Yu-Gi-Oh! As possible. Either they're going to put a bunch of negates on field, things like Crystal Wing or Zombie Stein, Titanic Galaxy, Hot Red Dragon, Archfiend Abyss, etc., or they're just going to try to floodgate you out of the door. That comes into play with things like, Outer Entity Azathoth or Amorphous Goliath, where it's basically a domain, you can't use your extra deck. Well, guess what? Super Polymerization answers all of that. If your opponent goes for the turn 1 Azathoth play, hell, they can even go for the Azathoth play with extra protection. You guys know how sometimes people are summoning Decode Talker just to have protection against, Twin Twister and Pankatrops. Guess what that doesn't cover? Super Poly, all you have to do is activate it in the standby or the draw phase. Your opponent cannot even use the Phantom Knights rank up launch, so that's kind of, not even applicable here. But even if they could, it wouldn't matter. You can simply use their Redoer, you can use their Decode Talker, you get your monster on field, their play is completely fractured, they're never going to get Azathoth on field, and you have yourself a boss monster to actually start beating them down with, and you have access to all your monster effects for the turn because Azathoth never hit the field. If your opponent has something like the Amorphous Goliath, where they're just like, alright, I'm going to summon this in the standby phase, I'm going to lock you out of your extra deck. Guess what? I can use Super Poly in the draw phase before the Amorphous Goliath hits the field. I can use your other monsters that are on the field and they can't respond in any way. So that Titanic Galaxy that you have on field, it can't use its effect to negate Super Poly. And then, as I mentioned earlier, if you're playing against Thunder Dragons, chances are they're going to end on like Zombie Stein or maybe Hot Red Dragon, Archfiend Abyss, sometimes both. They're going to probably end on Colossus. Every single monster that I just named is Dark. It allows you to make Starving Venom Fusion Dragon and just basically pick and choose which cards you want to get rid of. And I like Starving Venom because once you make that, you can actually crash it into one of their monsters and then it's sent to the graveyard and it nukes all their special summon monsters. So they basically all die, even if your opponent wants to be cheeky, right? Let's say they want to go for something like Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon. They're thinking, Cap G, I got you now. Now your guy can't nuke my board. That doesn't actually matter. Starving Venom can actually copy Crystal Wing's effect. If you try to destroy it when it tries to copy the effect, so what? It's just going to die and nuke your board, or you're just going to let it copy the effect. I can ram it into your Crystal Wing, and then guess what? Your Crystal Wing, or I can activate my effect to gain your Crystal Wing's attack. You can activate yours, but yours is going to resolve first. Thus, you're going to gain 2,800 attack. I'm going to gain 3,000 plus 2,800 attack, and I'm actually going to win. So it doesn't really matter what your opponent kind of throws at you. Super Polymerization is going to be answering that, and it's nice because even in some of the obscure matchups, right? Let's say you happen to run into a deck where you're thinking, man, Cap, there's no way that it can actually be good in that matchup. It actually might be. If you duel against something like Prank Kids, you can use it to, if your opponent has a couple of fusions on board, you guys know the ones that can tag out, or even the Link monsters, you can go for your own copy of like Prank Kids Rocket Ride. Your opponent can't respond in any way, so that's going to be super good. Even if your opponent is playing like a really obscure matchup where you would think Super Poly is going to be dead the entire game, that's not necessarily true. through. Let's take Guru Control as an example. That's like the premier like control deck right now in Yu-Gi-Oh! If your opponent has any 2 Subterror monsters on field, or if your opponent has like a Pankatrops plus a Subterror monster, that is going to actually work because you can hit them with that Mud Dragon of the Swamp off of Super Poly. You basically are going to get a 2 for 2. Well, actually it's a +1 because you're the one that's going to end up with the monster on field. They're going to be powerless. They're not going to be able to use Solemn Judgment or Fiendus in their hand or field to respond to your Super Poly, and I think that's going to be pretty legitimate. Now, as for where you can run Super Poly, I actually have a few decks you can run this in. I think 100% if you're running Guru Control right now in a TCG, I kind of feel like you should probably be running Super Poly in the main deck. They were doing this in multiples in the OCG. Guru Control does not need its extra deck at all, so you can fill up your entire extra deck with nothing but fusion monsters and be perfectly fine. If you're playing Sky Striker, this is another deck that not only is it fairly good going second, but Sky Striker has the room, it has the space in its extra deck to run a few cards that are fusion based, and it's really nice in Sky Striker because if you're playing against a deck that doesn't make a powerful turn 1 board, if it does happen to be dead, then you can simply discard it for your Twin Twister, or you can set it on the field and you can actually pop it with, like, I don't know, your Area Zero or your what's the card, multi-roll. And even if you do happen to summon your fusion monster and you're thinking, man, I got to get this thing out of my extra monster zone, you can use those same 2 cards to simply pop the monster after you've disrupted and broken your opponent's field. I guess the last deck I would consider this in highly would probably be something like Danger Zombies. Danger Zombies, I do believe, have a little bit of extra deck space, and Danger Zombies is nice because you can Super Poly with any 2 of your zombie monsters to go into Dragon, Necro, Nethersworn Dragon, which basically is just an extra 3,000 that can be useful in the battle phase, or you can use your opponent's monsters if you have Zombie World on field, and I think that that's really good as well. So zombies actually have some really good plays with Super Poly, and I think it's just a really excellent card this format. I think that it honestly is worth main deck consideration because it's good at breaking boards and it's good at even facilitating your own plays in decks like zombies or potentially in Salamangreat. So let me know what you guys think of Super Poly in the main deck, and if you're going to consider playing it moving forward this format. Whatever you guys think, leave it in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already and turn on that notification bell for daily videos.